Hey there, cats and kitties. I am the Blues Man, Johnny Blues, and with this video, we want to talk about the third episode of an anime series that I'm not actually covering in episodic review coverage this season, but that I am watching, and is one of a handful of fantasy RPG sort of stylized anime series, the name for which is rather lengthy, and I had to write it down because there's no way in hell I'm going to remember this. I'm going to have my go at trying to pronounce all of this. The lengthy title, it's one of the lengthiest titles I think I've encountered in my anime viewing, going all the way back to the beginning. I think they're just getting more nonsensical and lengthy with these titles, but in any case, this particular show is called Shumatsu Nani Shiete Masuka Isugashi Desuka Sukute Marate Lie Desuka, or WorldEnd. What do you do at the end of the world? Are you busy? Can you save us? Also shortened as SukaSuka, or there is a translation in the English where it says, can you save me, at the end of the title. It has been shortened to either SukaSuka or WorldEnd for understandable reasoning because of how long this frickin' title is. And it was a show from the first episode I found myself intrigued by, because you're following around, for all intents and purposes, this blue-haired girl who looks to be just an average human being, but in this mystical, magical world, and she's confronted by a bunch of these beastly characters, these more animal-looking humanoids. They have, various kinds of animal-like faces, from pigs to wolves and horses and all these kinds of things. There are even dragon people and all this kind of stuff. But when she is sort of, cornered at one point, because in the first episode she's chasing down a cat that stole sort of an amulet she had, they're very disdainful of anyone who looks like a normal, average, everyday human being. That is to say, without fur, without scales, anything like that. Just looks like a normal human being. And she ends up running into what is arguably the regular sort of main character of the series, this cat by the name of Willem, who helps her, retain her, the piece of jewelry she was trying to get back from the cat and everything. He goes and buys her a hat so she can kind of like cover her face up a little bit more and not be so stand out as just, sort of a fleshling, if you will, as opposed to all these humanoid animal beings and creatures. And he ends up helping her go to the top of this tower where she can overlook the entire lands, because apparently they are on sort of the ground level of whatever the planet is, but where she actually hails from is one of the many myriad floating islands. There are sort of floating continents or islands up in the skies, in the heavens, that people like her have to exist upon. They're not allowed down on the regular ground or whatever it is. They're very much disdained and disparaged, and there is some discrimination there. And even the main character, Willem, who is, as we find out, the sole survivor of all humanity, he too has to sort of be in hiding. And when they see him, at one point he had a hood on, and he gives it to her before buying her the hat, and they're all these creatures and everything are looking scathingly at him and whatever like that. And but lo and behold, does he eventually get employment after parting ways with this blue-haired girl? Does he find that his employment that he soon takes on has to do very much with her and a whole host of, it's like an orphanage, a whole host of children, mostly little girls, who are said to be some type of weapon. And you're kind of like, well, what does that mean? Were they weapons? Now, keeping in mind, this is a sort of fantasy RPG aesthetic framework and everything like that. It really sets up in the first two episodes a lot of questions about the character of Willem, his past. We see flashbacks through the first two episodes that, are said to be something like 100 or 500 years earlier. And you're kind of like, how is that possible? Was he just sort of maybe in his early 20s or something like that, if that, maybe he's in his late teens. How can that be? And it's supposed to be like 500 years hence that he's been around. And we call back on his past, where he was kind of sort of the adoptive father figure of a whole host of orphaned children, very much in the same way as he now finds this current employment in the here and now. And so, looking back at that past, the time frame there, he has a military background, he has some training and things of that sort, and he's kind of like a mercenary for hire, I guess, is kind of his employee, if you will, at the start of the series. But we find out that he's very knowledgeable on things that you wouldn't normally associate him being knowledgeable about, to do with the weapons that these children are set about to use in this grand battle with these beasts of old. Not the sort of beastly humanoid forms that are down on the planet below, but these other worldly, much more ginormous and earth-threatening, species-threatening, genocidal creatures that are very mobile, and every couple centuries or whatever it is, they will impact a threat upon the world, and somebody needs to defeat them. And in the case of all of these girls, we find out they are leprechauns using fairy abilities that allow them to go and fight off, stave off these attacking creatures on high. And in this third episode, the one that really was the clinchman for me of just, I was already sold on it. I was already intrigued by it. But I began to really appreciate the cleverness of the writing in this episode, because the other leg finally dropped on explaining a lot of what the hell was going on. What that was about Willem's past. He decides to sort of take under his wing the blue-haired girl, who we find her name, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, is Chtholi. And he decides, because she is the wielder of a weapon he once wielded hundreds and hundreds of years ago, we find out his past goes far and beyond just military training. He was, in fact, the wielder of the same, what they call Dug weapon, a sword that is made up of a bunch of different magical talismans that, when come together and utilized in the correct way, it's a very impactful weapon, but you have to know how to use it. And he has that familiarity with her weapon, and so he challenges her to sparring, and he wants to put her to the test, because she is resigned, as are all of these little girls, that their futures are basically already, null and void, because eventually they will have to be called upon to be utilized as weapons, to take up these Dug weapons, these swords, and fight off these creatures which will inevitably conclude their lives. And because of that resignation, he's very horrified, because he calls back on his past being the sort of fatherly figure hundreds of years ago, with a whole host of children that looked up to him, that he was the caregiver for and everything like that. And he left behind one sort of little sister who was kind of like the maternal role in that framework, who the last time he spent any time with, she made him promise to come back and she would make him his favorite snack, which was like this dessert butter bread or whatever it was. And eventually he goes off to battle, much in the same way as these girls are meant to in the here and now. And when he finally is woken up out of a 500-year sort of Captain America-esque being frozen in ice, he immediately finds out, when he's able to finally learn the language and speak to the current evolved humanoid form, which are these leprechaun-esque, fairy-wielding powered, humanoid beings that look, for all intents and purposes, human. He finds out that all of humanity that he once knew, including those nearest and dearest to his heart, had been wiped out. Even though he was successful those ages past in defeating the final of these earth-threatening genocidal beasts, he still lost it all. And he was supposed to die at that moment, but eventually he was frozen and he was revived so many centuries later by the sort of main crux of characters. One in particular, who I had to write the name down because it's one that I would never really remember off the top of my head, Nigletho, who I think they said she's an ogre or something like that. Correct me in the comments below if you're watching the series and you know better than I do. Please keep in mind, if you're familiar with the source material, I am not, so I'm just sort of going by the seat of my pants in describing this and sort of reacting to it in this video, so I don't want to hear any spoilery stuff or anything like that. But if you happen to know better what her species is and how to pronounce these names, let me know. But I just wanted to put it out there because as he's sparring with Chtholi, she's really kind of at the point where it's going to break her every last nerve and a little bit of her resolve to now have to face the idea that her whole life has been a lie. She doesn't have to necessarily go to her demise in defeating this creature by opening, I think they call it the fairy gate or whatever it is. There are only so many days by this point in the series where she has to go to battle. She and two other, sort of leprechaun compatriots will be sent into battle, and she'll be wielding her Dug weapon, and she'll have to utilize it to open a fairy gate, which will seek out the purpose of destroying and quelling the beast for another, century or whatever it is. But in doing so, she must sacrifice herself. and she's lived her whole life for not that many years. I think she's in her teens, like the age of 16 or 17. You know, she's already resigned herself to the fact that she's not coming back from this. This is her sole purpose. This is all she can really hold any hope for any kind of living. And that's kind of why it makes it that much more moving in the first episode when Willem and she are first introduced, because she very much just wanted to experience something she hadn't experienced before, something that will be lost to all of these girls in time if their futures, you know, their fates are thusly sealed, that they will be weapons and they will each go to their demise in trying to quell these beasts and things of that nature by going to that tower top, that rooftop, and wanting to see the land before her, see something awesome and beautiful and that kind of thing. She wanted to share her first kiss with him at one point in the second episode, I think it was, when she comes back from a battle that is not so lethal, but that leaves her body racked. And there's some playful coyness between them because she's never experienced love or romance or attraction or any of these things. And a lot of these little girls, they're at first afraid of Willem because people who are usually employed as the security officer overseeing them, the protectorate officer, as he thusly is in this series, all of them have either been destroyed, killed off, or left of their own volition because they can't really cope with the idea of spending time with these little girls who are going to go off to their demise, who are going to be weaponized for all intents and purposes with their special abilities and their special weapons hailing back to ages past. And so you see Chtholi being very much an upstart and having to confront the sort of brutal reality that, hey, wait a minute, there is actually hope here that if I'm well trained enough, if I know how to manipulate and wield this weapon, you know, this sword that Willem himself once wielded, who he knows that much more about, if he can train her, and subsequently she can come back from this ill-fated, potentially, you know, meeting where she has to open that fairy gate. This is where we leave off by the end of the third episode, by the way. She has been sent off. And you know, it's kind of convenient calling back on his own past, because that memory of that little sister, that maternal sister of his, all those hundreds of years ago, that promise that she made him, you know, swear to, you'll come back alive and I'll make you your butter bread. Well, it turns out very similarly so when she is confronted with having to go off, Chtholi, that is to say, has to go off and open the fairy gate and potentially lose her life. If she survives it with his guidance and training, she wants him to make her butter bread. And he kind of reacts to that by saying, you know, of all things, it's kind of like you look at Casablanca, the classic movie, where Bogey's like, of all the gin joints in all the world, she has to walk back into mine. She has to remind me of the past I wanted to let so much go of. And that's kind of what's going on with Willem in that scene. You know, where it's right on the crux of the dawn of the next day. She's going to be leaving for this fairy gate opening that may see to her untimely demise. And the last request she has is one that was a request of his own sort of, you know, adoptive daughter those hundreds of years ago, whom after he went to battle and he was woken up hundreds of years later, did he find they were all wiped out. Even for his success, they were still all succumbed to that genocide and everything like that. And it's just that other leg dropping, the creativity of the writing of this series, sort of laying the foundations in the first and second episodes and giving you hints and whispers all throughout, you know, sort of peppered all throughout. And then finally, it's only the third episode, and I feel like we have thus far been given so much information, so much impactful information and awesome information, in that now we understand what is going on with this cat. He was once a wielder of the same dug weapon as Chtholi. You know, he knows how to utilize it to the fullest effect. And his having harbored a life where he was taking care of children before he himself went off to battle, now finding himself as a security officer overseeing the protection of a new band of children who may or may not be human, you know, in their origins, but are still very much little girls who just are going to be lacking so much experience and all of the great aspects of life. Now to be confronted with this, you know, he lost it all in one such battle ages past, and now he's going to see all these children potentially going and losing it all themselves, one by one. It's tragic, but it's also that much more awesome because he is actually someone who is beholden of the hope that he can maybe change things around. He can maybe turn the tide for them. And especially very much being the folks of Chtholi herself, who had abandoned all hope and expected this was the only life ahead of her, a very short life that would see to quelling the beast for however many centuries to come, and it would just be, these children would be sent one after the other until they were all gone. But maybe he can affect a positive change. Maybe he can change that. It's an inspiring and no less compelling sort of dynamic, because, as I say, now taking in tandem all of this history of his own life, you're told in the first episode he had flashbacks of 500 years hence, and how is that possible? And this woman I referred to earlier, the name being Nigletho or whatever, being this ogre or whatever she is, she was one of the first to actually meet him when he was rejuvenated, and so there's a playful dynamic between them. She's kind of like the closest thing he can get to a modern day guidepost to understand everything that's going on. But then he himself becomes the guidepost for these girls, for Chtholi and all these other little girls, in the hopes of trying to make a more positive change, trying to give them hope. Because there's an example, I think it's in the second episode, where he very shockingly sees just how resigned they all are to their lives being relatively meaningless, and that is when they're out playing in the yard and they're playing with like a soccer ball or something, and it ends up going down this little cliff, and one of the little girls goes over the cliff without even thinking, and she falls down the cliff, and she's all bloodied and bludgeoned, and she might have had broken bones, whatever it is, and she's still going to get the ball, and all these other children are still egging her on, go get the ball, without any care or concern for her well-being. Because what does it matter? Our lives are forfeit anyway. We're just weapons. And this impacts him in to such a degree where they figure he's going to be afraid, he's going to be scared, he's going to be scarred, and he's going to leave them all packing, and that's not what he does. Rather does he take up that sword of old, and he ushers a challenge to Chtholi to teach her to become stronger with the weapon, to teach her to have hope for living. And that's just the third episode. So there's a lot of stuff with this series. I don't know if I'm articulating it all well enough. For those who are uninitiated, who haven't been watching it, who may or may not, be into giving a fantasy sort of series, a chance and everything like that. The writing, I feel, is very clever in its pacing, in how it's pacing along those revelations and answering to those qualms and mysteries that they set up in the early going. And there seems to be so much more to it, and I just can't wait to find out how much more of this story is going to unravel and in which directions it may go. Because the first episode started off with a prologue sequence that seemed to show another character entirely that I don't think we've as yet been introduced to, unless it was Chtholi with a hair color change, that was like about to potentially go and sacrifice her life. And she seemed to be very upset about having lost someone. And I don't know if that was someone lost to Willem, if that was someone even associated with him, anything like that. I'm loosely wondering and suspecting if we will find out that his ages past little maternal-esque sister might have gone on to be one of these very first generational leprechaun beings with these powers, and, because we find out from Chtholi that one of them, the reason why she wants the butterbread, they made that promise between them as he had done with this maternal little sister ages past. She says that it was one of the elders who would go out to battle, and eventually, I guess she, had died in a similar sacrifice that they are expecting Chtholi to do with opening the fairy gate. But whenever she would come back from battle with these beasts and these creatures, she would always celebrate with butterbread. And I just thought that was kind of an interesting little footnote that opens the door for, well, could this be someone Willem knew in his past? Somebody, whether personally connected to him or whether somebody inspired by him unknowingly, remains to be seen. But it's just, I love the pacing of this series. I love how they are doling out the revelations and making sense of a lot of the things that you're left really quizzical wondering about, you know. And as I say, it's one of a handful of you know, fantasy sort of RPG anime series I'm watching this season. You have this one, Rage of Bahamut, Virgin Soul, and Sword Oratoria, which I'm covering in reviews. I've got Grand Blue Fantasy, Grimoire of Zero, Recreators, Clockwork Planet, and Little Witch Academia, which are kind of sort of fantasy series in their own right. Although I would argue Clockwork Planet's a little more steampunk sci-fi. But this is the most anime I've watched in a given season in my entire life right now. And the most fantasy RPG sort of stylized anime types of shows that I've ever watched, probably ever as well. You know, and I've been enjoying them all to various degrees. Some are better than others, but I found reasons to enjoy them all. And I really wanted to talk about this one, SukaSuka or WorldEnd, because I just really like the intriguing plot and the characters. All of the little girls are hilarious in their own various ways. They all have these immensely distinct personalities. Some are very outgoing, some are perverted, some are very shy. You know, it's all utmost hilarious. Some are intellectual, some are very reserved. You know, but you can tell they're probably like little mini tyrants and everything like that. You have the playful relationship with, again, referring to the paper Negletho, the ogre, again, I believe is what she is. She's a maid in the here and now, and she was one of the first who was there when Willem was found, excavated from the ice, and woken up again, a la Captain America, as I say. And Chitholi, who is just an endearing character for her wanting to now fight for life, you know, where she had been so reserved of the fact that she would lose it penultimately if going to battle, if having to be summoned forth to open this fairy gate, to quell this beast that she's being dragged out, you know, by the skin of her teeth, by her neck to battle and everything, with the sacrifice of her life impending. It's just all really highly intriguing, and I know this video is long and rambly, but I just had to talk about it in some fashion, because I find it highly intriguing. It's definitely a show I'm sticking with. I'm going to be watching all the way through to the end, even if I don't pick it up for reviews and I don't discuss it every week. But I wanted to put it out there for anyone who might not be watching it, anyone who is, who might agree with me that it is pretty clever and interesting and intriguing and all that kind of stuff, very compelling. You know, for that reason, I'd love to hear from you guys in the comments below. If you're watching the series, if you're going to give it a shot, whatever, you know, anything goes, love it or hate it, as long as we have a great conversation about it. And yeah, that'll be pretty much it for me on this. Hope this video finds you well, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.